This is Sorrel Hillman, and we are about to go into the sixth in a series of 10 informal discussions with the eminent critic and author John Mason Brown on the general subject of the humanities. And in this talk, Mr. Brown, we will be exploring the subject of character as it is revealed in life as well as in literature.
Well, I'm glad, Mr. Hillman, that you mentioned life, because the judgment of character in life seems to me almost as instinctive as the judgment of character by an audience or reader in the presence of a work of art. Do you remember a novelist called Miss Mary Johnson? She was a Virginian. She wrote To Have and to Hold.
Yes, I do remember.
But Miss Mary Johnson used to run, shall we say, a place for PGs, known in the South as paying guests. And she had this wonderful old Negro who had been with her for years and years and really ran the place for her. And one day a New York playwright came down, and Miss Mary said to the Negro, "Sam, tomorrow," said, "you just better carry that man his breakfast. He likes to have it in bed." And Sam said, "Miss Mary, you didn't have to tell me that. I just had to take one look at that man to know he's a bed eater." That is an instinctive sensing of character. Now, we sniff character, it seems to me, in 1,000 ways, usually unconsciously. I don't know about your appraisals of character, but you watch for gestures, inflection, voice, the contour, the emphasis of a face, clothes, hair, how it's done, vocabulary especially. Any single word can, the word itself that just happens to open up on the part even of the speaker, an unsuspected vista. In any word, a man can give himself away entirely. At least you get an aspect of character. You remember that Anatole France once said, "We speak of ourselves every time we have not the strength to remain silent." And he said of a man being honest, a professor, if he were lecturing on Shakespeare, instead of saying, "I will now lecture on Shakespeare," he would say in full candor, "I am lecturing on myself on the subject of Shakespeare."
As revealed through Shakespeare.
The only Shakespeare that he can talk about is the Shakespeare that has been filtered through his particular character. Now we come back to the phrases. May I give you an illustration or two that I've never forgotten from real life? In 1952, I followed the two political trains, General Eisenhower's and Governor Stevenson's. And when both men were ardently campaigning, and I was on each of these trains for 4 days, listening to them for about 14 times each day, I couldn't help but notice certain verbal differences. I'm not talking about felicity of language, but General Eisenhower had a habit of saying, and he said it again and again and again, he would interrupt a speech to say, "I am told," or "someone has told me." Governor Stevenson never employed that phrase at all. He would say, "I am reminded," or "that reminds me." Now those are, it seems, almost immediate insights into, shall we say, the knowledge of background at that particular point.
Perhaps, but Eisenhower won.
He certainly won, I am told. And that reminds me, he won a second time. There's another illustration that I'm groping for, and this is one that has to do with almost a complete unconscious giveaway of character. You are too young to know anything about the League of Nations except as a childhood memory. But at the time when the League of Nations was being vehemently discussed, and when Senator Henry Cabot Lodge and the Republicans were mainly against Mr. Wilson, there was a conference at the White House, and it was conducted on the highest level of diplomatic decency and gentlemanly courtesy. The question at the time, the core of the argument, happened to be two articles in the League Treaty, Articles 10 and 11, and a senator was present. The senator was Warren Gamaliel Harding, and the discussion, as I say, had been on the highest moral level. And Mr. Wilson had made the point that this was a moral commitment. And Mr. Harding interrupted and said, "Right here, Mr. President, if there is nothing more than a moral obligation on the part of any member of the League, what avails Articles 10 and 11? And Wilson's reply was, "Why, Senator, it is surprising that that question should be asked. A moral obligation is, of course, superior to a legal obligation, and if I may say so, has a much greater binding force." This was before the Teapot Dome, but the Teapot Dome was already there.
And, of course, it tells as much about Wilson as it does about Harding.
Both men are revealed.
Yes.
And this is not in a choice of word, but in an attitude of spirit and mind.
But as a reporter, I think I can testify that there are a great many people who do not reveal themselves quite that
easily or unconsciously or fully. And there are an awful lot of people who are on guard so much that they don't give themselves away.
Well, I think probably anybody with a Darwinian instinct of survival, or self-preservation of the fittest, would develop some kind of protective armor in the presence, say, of a reporter from Time magazine. It would occur to me only natural in the manly art of self-defense. But I still believe that no man, even in the presence of a reporter from Time magazine, the most skilled of reporters, no man, however deliberately he tries to shield himself, can shield himself completely. It's my conviction that when someone such as Miss Rita Garbo or somebody like Carmine de Sapio, and they are very dissimilar in their beauty, when they wear dark glasses, they may think they are hiding themselves, but they make themselves the more conspicuous, and by the mere attempt to be hidden ostrich-wise, they become as naked public property as can exist. They can't hide, and I don't believe people in the long run can ever hide their characters. I think what can confuse people is not the discretion of speech or the vapidity of speech, but what can confuse people is the complexity of human character. Men and women are so many people at once. You remember the great line of Walt Whitman's, "Do I contradict myself? Very well, I contradict myself. I contain multitudes." And of course, most of us are unaware of the multitudes within the people that we are talking to. We are well aware of the conflicts within ourselves.
What would be a good example in fiction of the multi-complex character?
Well, let me approach that slowly. Let me start with the drama just for a moment, and an old play that if you are a reader of Thomas Hardy, you may have encountered in The Return of the Native. It's the Christmas play, and it's the Lutterworth Christmas play. Now, this is as simple as it can be. Every character appears and says as follows. Enter Captain Slasher. "I beg your pardon for being so bold. I enter your house, the weather is so cold. Room, room, a gallant's for sport. Room in this house, for we do resort for many a day. Step in, the King of England, and boldly clear the way." Enter the King of England. "King of England, I am the King of England, that boldly does appear. I come to seek my only son is here." Enter Prince George.
You're sure that wasn't written by one of Hardy's grandchildren?
Either way, but now then the king's son gets into a fight. Now this is my favorite part of it. And the King of England must have had Scotch blood in him, because when Prince George falls, mortally wounded or wounded, the king says, "Oh, horrible, terrible, what hast thou done? Thou hast ruined me by killing of my only son. Oh, is there ever a noble doctor to be found to cure this English champion of his deep and deadly wound?" Enter a noble doctor. This is faster than Bellevue or Roosevelt service. "Oh, yes, there is a noble doctor to be found who can cure this English champion of his deep and deadly wound. Pray, what do you practice?" And the next question is, "How much does it cost?" That's the king. There's no attempt at characterization there. These are just saying, practically with the name above.
So you almost had to have a sandwich sign on.
Yes, but then you come to the realization that life is a little bit more complicated than that, and you can get into an awful lot of trouble. Let's come into one way of doing it, and this is the way that O'Neill reached for. I'm not in any sense of the word denying the magnitude of the talent. I'm just trying to say here that by trying from his inquiring mind to express the complexity of man, he oversimplified the means of so doing in two instances that we all remember. Strange Interlude and the Great God Brown. And in the Great God Brown, he wanted to show that man was both good and evil. That is not a very difficult thought. I think other people got there ahead of him with it. But to do that, if you remember, he had masks.
Yes.
A mask for good and evil, and there was all this changing.
Switching back and forth.
Who am I now? The point was that this duality of the human nature was admirable. But by the time you have all this visual switching, it became so simple because man is much more than dual. It is really the plurality of a human individual rather than the duality. And then he tried in the Strange Interlude to tap the stream of consciousness. And that was a person would speak aloud as you and I are speaking, then in a different voice and at a different pace would release what were the inner thoughts, what you are really thinking about me, and what I am really thinking about you.
Please don't tell me.
I have no intention of. That's for a different and closed circuit. But this kind of ventriloquism was admirable in intention, but it always seemed to me too simplified. It's much easier to do in the novel.
As in Joyce. Classic example, the stream of consciousness.
Well, that is the beginning of Freud's impact. This is the release of the hidden spring of man's nature, what's in the back of the mind. And because you know as well as I do that most of us continue to talk, if we are talking, and at the same time we are saying other things within ourselves. And that was, of course, the basis for the O'Neill attempt. In the theater, at the present time, it is much harder to give away a character than it once was. This is the depths of character.
In what sense?
Well, because the theater, of course, has become a realistic medium. Ever since the beginning of the 19th century, when they took over the well-made play, and then when Ibsen came along and brought his mind to the form that Scribe and Dumas, etc., had developed, they began to work behind the proscenium arch and to pretend that the fourth wall had been removed. And the minute you got inside of that room and were supposedly sitting there, only with the wall mysteriously removed so that no one in the room knew that the wall was missing, and you were part of the wall, people had no reason to suddenly do what they had done in earlier plays, and that is to indulge in the soliloquy. Nowadays, at home, if we had anybody in our house working for us who talked to herself too long and too frequently, I think we'd call for somebody with a straitjacket, or at least we'd move out rather rapidly. But the soliloquy was the Freudian device of the Elizabethan dramatists. That is, when other people had left the stage, Hamlet, Macbeth, Iago, Cleopatra, Antony, whoever it happened to be, could come straight to the platform and there ventilate his soul.
Well, what would Shakespeare have been without the soliloquy?
Well, the soliloquy was long before Freud, and long before people could only understand themselves by lying down on couches. Shakespeare proved that you could understand yourself standing up, and he did it admirably in soliloquy after soliloquy.
Well, of course, Shakespeare, in a sense, had an easier time in developing character in that he was allowed to use the soliloquy, whereas a contemporary playwright who can't use it has all that much harder a time. Isn't that right?
Yes, to a certain extent. Not necessarily true, because you will find now that playwrights do fall back on the soliloquy occasionally. Mr. Tennessee Williams occasionally will give you a character who mutters. Mr. Thornton Wilder, of course, has done it again and again, but that is in making fun of an older convention. Speaking of older conventions, let me show you what realism gave us. This is the way of revealing the character, a character as yet unseen. Do you remember, Mr. Hillman, when you were young, were these atrocities still being committed? Did the first act curtain go up on a drawing room? There was a piano, usually at one side, the fireplace with the other side. Everything was very, very Mayfair. And there was a beautiful young French maid with a feather duster, dusting around, saying, woo, la, 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 la. In a few moments, in would come the butler. We'll call him G, whatever you want to say.
It's only virtually every play I ever saw in those days.
Well, then he would say, Marie, has young Sir John come in yet? He didn't cough. That isn't the butler coughing. That's
I was just trying to give a little offstage realism.
Well, that's the horse approaching carrying young Sir John. Mary, has young Sir John come in yet? Ooh la la, says Mary. He seemed bent on quite a night ennui last evening. And the butler says, 'tis pity his lordship of high birth is so given to low company, and in his difficult position is so readily snared by easy virtue. And at this point, Sir John enters, young Sir John. It's 10 o'clock in the morning, and he still is dressed to the teeth, white tie and tails, and we know a great deal about young Sir John. Now, that is one of the more odious forms of exposition.
I can think of a contemporary example that strikes me as pretty bad, actually from the great O'Neill hit, Touch of the Poet, which, as I remember, starts out with a couple of low characters in a New England tavern, sitting around discussing the tavern keeper, his wife, his daughter, and more or less giving you the entire pitch before any of the main characters come out, which I thought was a very clumsy device.
I agree with you utterly. But let me give you what I think is one of the great examples of O'Neill's technique at its very resilient, dramatic best. And this is in Anna Christie, and in the first act in the waterfront saloon. If you remember, the old Swedish father of Anna Christie, who has been getting a load on.
He's a dead old double C man?
He's always shaking his fist at the unseen waters. But he is, at this point, expecting his daughter, and he hasn't seen his daughter for many, many years. Anna Christie is coming to New York, and she enters suddenly, at least a girl enters, and the father has described her as this pure, this beautiful, this innocent girl living in Minnesota, someplace where purity is easily maintained. And the door pushes open into the saloon, and enter this woman with the feathers in the hat, and instead of being that Minnesota farm girl, she is a tall, blonde, fully developed girl of 20, handsome after a large Viking or Viking daughter fashion, but now run down in health, and plainly...
At 20?
Just let me finish. And plainly showing all the outward evidence of belonging to the world's oldest profession.
This is O'Neill's stage directions?
That's the stage direction, but this is the line, and you don't need the direction. The actress lives up to the directions. The line is, she totters in, sits at the table wearily, and she says to the waiter, "Give me a whiskey, ginger ale on the side, and don't be stingy, baby." And in a moment, you have Anna Christie. Just as in a few moments later, you have the superb moment when the old woman, the mistress who lives on the barge with Anna's father, takes one look at Anna and certainly understands what her profession is. And Anna says, "What are you looking at me this way for? Who are you?" And Marty, the old woman, says, "I'm you 20 years from now, baby." And in both cases, you have a superb summary of situation and character.
Faintly obvious, perhaps.
Well, not as obvious as it
Faintly
sounds.
harsh on the world's oldest profession, too.
Well, the world's oldest profession is not necessarily rejuvenating, I'm told.
Well, I'd like to bring up the instance of a contemporary of O'Neill, Sinclair Lewis. I ran across Babbitt again the other night, and I was struck by a couple of paragraphs which seemed to me to superbly reach in and pluck out a character and lay him right on the table in front of me. And this is how it goes. All the way home from Maine, Babbitt was certain that he was a changed man. He was converted to serenity. He was going to cease worrying about business. He was going to have more interest. Theaters, public affairs, reading. And suddenly, as he finished an especially heavy cigar, he was going to stop smoking. He invented a new and perfect method. He would buy no tobacco. He would depend on borrowing it. And of course, he would be ashamed to borrow often. In a spasm of righteousness, he flung his cigar case out of the smoking compartment window. He went back and was kind to his wife about nothing in particular. He admired his own purity and decided absolutely simple, just a matter of willpower. He started a magazine serial about a scientific detective. 10 miles on, he was conscious of a desire to smoke. He ducked his head like a turtle going into its shell. He appeared uneasy. He skipped 2 pages in his story and didn't know it. 5 miles later, he leaped and sought the porter. "Say, George, have you got a..." The porter looked patient. "Have you got a timetable?" Babbitt finished. At the next stop, he went out and bought a cigar. Since it was to be his last, he finished it down to an inch stub.
Oh, that is a fine
Now,
one.
isn't that good?
Do you remember the line of Mark Twain when somebody said, "How do you give up smoking?" And he said, "Ask me," said Mark Twain. "It's the easiest thing in the world. I've done it 1,000 times." And this is what Babbitt is suffering from there. But may I come to a master builder who happened to bring a master mind to a highly complicated jigsaw form. I'm speaking of Ibsen, and I'm speaking in particular of a book called From Ibsen's Workshop. Well, it is the collection of all the notes, the germinal ideas, the development of scenes, the first draft, the second draft, the third draft. And Ibsen, of course, was the most painstaking of craftsmen. And here in just a little short scene from A Doll's House is an indication how merely a shift in words can give you a whole new dimension of character. This is the scene, the famous scene, when, as you remember, Nora is that girl who ultimately shuts the door. And when she bangs the door, that is a shot heard round the world. And she, from having been a kind of frightened, half-witted housewife, a little timid thing, suddenly becomes the bold new woman. But she has lived, and Ibsen's point is that men and women live by different standards of morality, especially as far as finance is concerned. Men have one code of monetary honor, and women have a different one. So when Nora's husband is taken ill, Nora, if you remember, forges to get enough money to pay for the illness. Then the question is, will the man who has the forged check turn her in, so to speak, or turn her husband in when he's recovered? And the letter is delivered, in which everything is to be decided. And you can tell this is an old-fashioned play because there's a maid in it. It's almost impossible on or off stage to get a maid now. That's just a theatrical illusion. But Nora stands motionless, and the maid goes to the door. You hear the letter dropping into the box at the back. "Here's a letter for you, ma'am. Helma, give it here." He seizes the letter and shuts the door. "Yes, it's from him. Look here. Nora, read it. Helma, I have hardly the courage. I fear the worst. We may both be lost, both you and I. I must know." Hastily he tears the letter open, reads a few lines, and then with a cry of joy says, "Nora." Nora looks inquiringly at him. Helma. Nora, oh, I must read it again. Yes, yes, it is so. You are saved, Nora. You are saved. How saved, and so forth. Now let me come to the next draft, the final draft, the great draft. Remember, it's Nora, you are saved, Nora. You are saved. Same business, the letter dropping through the maid. Ellen, here is a letter for you, ma'am. Helma, give it to me. He seizes the letter, shuts the door. Yes, from him. You shall not have it. I shall read it. Read it. And he goes over to the lamp. I have hardly the courage to. We may be lost, both you and I. I must know. Hastily he tears the letter open, reads a few lines, looks at an enclosure, and then gives a cry of joy. Nora! Nora! And she looks at him with natural curiosity. Helma says, Nora, I must read it again. Yes, yes, it is so. I am saved, Nora. I am
yes,
saved.
I remember that.
And one pronoun makes all the difference in the world, because the man who said, you are saved, is certainly a more generous man than the man who is thinking only of himself and says, I.
Exactly.
But this is the revelation by the single choice of a word in terms of realism.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always seemed to me admirable. I would like to, if I may, go to the difference between writing, say, for the novel and for the stage. There are two scenes that have always fascinated me because they come as near as any scenes could to illustrating the difference between what is fine in the novel and what is fine in the theater, and the totally different means that have to be employed. I'm starting with a book, alas, I believe at the present moment, all too forgotten, but an admirable book, and this is Galsworthy's The Forsyte Saga. There was a queen, we all remember her, that widow of Windsor, Queen Victoria. And I want to give you, if I may, two approaches to describing Queen Victoria's death and its impact on London and the character that Victoria herself possessed. This is from Galsworthy and the Forsyte Saga. The Queen was dead, and the air of the greatest city upon earth grey with unshed tears. Fur-coated and top-hatted, with Annette beside him in dark furs, Soames crossed Park Lane on the morning of the funeral procession to the rails in Hyde Park. And then we move on to more of the family until we come to what was really happening, the overtone, the real meaning of the Queen's death. And Galsworthy writes, and to witness a great age, whose transmuting influence nothing had escaped save the nature of man and the nature of the universe, and to witness the passing of this age, London, its pet and fancy, was pouring forth her citizens through every gate into Hyde Park, hub of Victorianism, happy hunting ground of Forsytes. Under the grey heavens, whose drizzle just kept off, the dark concourse gathered to see the show. The good old Queen, full of years and virtue, had emerged from her seclusion for the last time to make a London holiday. From Houndsditch, Acton, Ealing, Hampstead, Illington, and Bethnal Green, from Hackney, Hornsey, Leiston and Fulham, and from those green pastures where Forsytes flourish, Mayfair and Kensington, St. James's and Belgravia, Bayswater and Chelsea, and Regent's Park, the people swarmed. And then, of course, you move right straight. There it was. How sad, how beautiful, he heard Annette whisper. How sad, how beautiful, and felt the clutch of her hand as she stood up on tiptoe, and the crowd's emotion gripped him. There it was, the bier of the Queen, coffin of the age, slow passing, and so forth. Now that is, it seems to me, an admirable description in terms of the characters involved in what is the moment of history when Victorianism dies.
Putting the main figures themselves right into the heart of this.
That is it. Now let me come to this done in 6 lines. This is the difference between the novel, with its necessity for descriptive approach, and the theater's necessity for illustrative approach. Let me come to a famous scene that we all know, and this is the scene in Cavalcade, when the Queen casket, or bier, is passing the house where the characters happen to be assembled. And if you remember, the servants, this is very British, the servants are at one side, they've all been brought into the living room, and they're going out on the balcony to watch the passing of the procession, and the family's on the other, and the little children are there too. And suddenly, there is a dead silence, and then far away, the solemn music of the Dead March is heard. As it draws nearer, the children jump about excitedly. Joe, suddenly, look, look, there's Father, there's Father. Jane, shh, Joe, be quiet still. The procession continues. Suddenly there is an outburst of cheering from the crowd, which is instantly subdued. That's Lord Roberts. He held up his hand to stop them cheering. Is that Bob's, Mum? Is that Bob's? Edward, look. Look, one-armed Gifford. Oh, Mother, look. Jane, shh. Now then, Joe, Edward, stand absolutely still. To attention, like your father showed you. The boys stand rigid with their hands to their sides. Bridges stands rigid with his hands to his side on the other balcony. The music swells as the band passes directly underneath them. As it begins to die away, Cook bursts into tears. Jane, 5 kings riding behind her. And Joe, the little boy, Mum, she must have been a very little lady. And the lights fade. And there.
Coward should have been knighted for that scene.
No, it is a glorious scene.
It is
And the one line, the whole build-up, the class division, the class unity, the balcony, the sound, the applause for the preceding soldier, the silence when the queen passes, the salute, the emperor and the kings, and then the whole scene summarized by the boy. Mum, she must have been a very little lady. It seems to me extraordinary in terms of theatrical conjuring. And that is this indirect approach that I speak of to the theater. Did you ever happen to read a superb spoof by Mr. George Bernard Shaw, a gentleman not unknown to us nor undiscussed in our previous conversations? I promise not to do it at any length.
From what?
This is from one of the finest of all Shaw volumes, one scarcely known here and scarcely read here. It's a collection of his journalism, which in his case, his journalism happened to be literature, a collection published under the name of Pen Portraits and Reviews. And Arnold Bennett had written a little book. He was always writing little books on craftsmanship, and this was called The Author's Craft, in which he was trying to point out, because Mr. Bennett wrote both plays and novels, he was trying to point out that it's much easier to write a play than it is to write a novel. And this outraged Shaw. And so Mr. Shaw just published a certain scene from a certain play that we all remember, Macbeth, by Shaw's predecessor, William Shakespeare. And the scene is the last scene in Macbeth, and one of the reasons I think that Macbeth does not rank as one of the great Shakespearean tragedies, and why he ends up as a tired old gangster, clanging in armor and speaking blank verse, very much like an early Dillinger, at last surrounded. And this is Macbeth. Why should I play the Roman fool and die on mine own sword, whiles I see lives, the gashes do better upon them. Enter Macduff, who has quite an accurate sense of phrasing as well as blade work. Macduff, turn, hellhound, turn. Macbeth, of all man else I have avoided thee, but get thee back. My soul is much too charged with blood of thine already. And Macduff, I have no words. My voice is in my sword. Of course he does have words. That's all people who say, forgive me, I have nothing to say. Thou bloodier villain than terms can give thee out. And then there's a good deal of talk about being born of women and this and that, and naturally born. I bear a charm life which must not yield to one of woman born. Despair thy charm, and let the angel whom thou still hast served tell thee Macduff was from his mother's womb unkindly ripped. Accursed be the tongue that tells me so, and so forth and so forth. And then he goes on to talk about Birnam Wood, and he also mentions the birds. And this is the end of that particular scene. Let me just give you one sample of it turned into a novel by Mr. Shaw. He was to fail, after all. The day was going against him. His men were not really fighting. They had conveyed to Old Sword that they were open to any offer of quarter, and the hint had not been lost on that ancient campaigner whose son he had just slain. What was the use of killing Duncan, Banquo, the Macduff people? He had waded through their blood, and how much better would it not be if it were all a dream and they were alive and kind to him? Do you remember I mentioned the birds? Now, how the martins were singing. Banquo, always a bit of a fool, had been sentimental about the martins. Cruach, the dear dead wife, whom the Southrons persisted in calling Lady Macbeth, had argued with Banquo about them, telling him that their habits were insanitary, and that they were infested with small bugs which got into the castle, already too rich in insect life. This goes on for about 5 pages. Then Mr. Shaw picks up the birds again and says, the birds are still singing on Dunsinane. The wood pigeon still coos about the coos, and Malcolm takes them frankly and generously. It is not for us to judge him or to judge Macbeth. Macbeth was born before his time. Men call him a villain. But had the press existed in his day, a very trifling pecuniary sacrifice on his part would have made a hero of him. And to do him justice, he was never stingy. Well, well, the end. And Shaw adds, there, that's what's called novel writing. I raise no idle question as to whether it is easy or not. Fine art of any sort is either easy or impossible. But that sort of thing I can write by the 100,000s of words on my head. I believe that if I turned my attention to the mechanics for a month or two, I could make a typewriter attachment that would do it like the calculating attachment that has come lately into use. The odd thing is that people seem to like it. They swallow it in doses of 300 pages at a time, and they are not at all keen on Shakespeare. Decidedly, when my faculties decay a little further, said Shaw, I shall go back to novel writing, and Arnold Bennett can fall back on writing plays.
Oh, that's marvelous. Of course, there are a great many characters. Macbeth would certainly be one of them. Brilliantly delineated in plays or novels. I'm not so certain that Macbeth is, but there are many whom we would really loathe in real life, aren't there?
That is unquestionably true, and it's one of the tantalizing dilemmas of aesthetics, or one of the aesthetic problems raised by aesthetic appreciation. The people that we happen to like in our own living would not necessarily include half the characters we are profoundly interested in and moved by in the theater. You and I, for example, when we sit before Hamlet, never think that he should be called into the police court, that he has 2 murders to his credit. We never think of him in terms of the Black Maria.
Also, that he might be a bit of a bore around the living room.
Well, certainly in terms of Macbeth, I can't imagine anyone I would rather not have for the weekend as a guest. Old King Duncan found that out.
I'd certainly disarm him first.
I would certainly frisk him under the portcullis. King Lear is another character, glorious on the stage, but certainly would be
He'd be a trial, yes.
Geriatric would go to work there. Any of the villains that we see on the stage somehow are part of our escape from our own living. We buttress our lives as much as we can on the basis of our taste, instincts, and what we happen to be. But
the
yet,
wife killer, for example, is all of us.
Well, speak for yourself. I'm very happy. But what I'm trying to say is that we escape from the limitations of our own life, or the penalties of our self-imposed or society-imposed decencies, by wandering off with delight into the realms of murder, into the realms of delinquency, into the realms of, well, take any of the characters that we have seen recently in the theater. Take the dope peddlers, the hopheads, take the various delinquents. We wouldn't want them in our houses, that isn't the point, but we certainly have room for them in our hearts and interests if they are properly presented. There's no exclusion on the basis of theme.
The obverse of that is that so many of the well-delineated nice characters are people who probably wouldn't interest us in the least.
Well, this is where life and art really do have very much in common. One of the most difficult things to make interesting is virtue. We hope for it in life, and we hope eventually that somebody will be virtuous in a novel.
Well, Jane Austen is one of the very few.
But she was writing about manners. This is a different thing. She was not writing in terms of
morals as such.
No, and Elizabeth Bennet is no prude. Now let's take some of the virtuous characters even in Shakespeare. Take Desdemona, and you can take her far away as far as I'm concerned.
Not easily.
Well, I don't know. There's more there than meets the eye. Take Juliet as a young girl. Take Cordelia, who at least has the virtue of honesty. I think that they are quite boring morons, the three of them. And they seem to me like the end of the Little Colonel series. Or the Bobbsey twins.
The Bobbsey twins, yes.
Bobbsey twins. They're just about that, only in Elizabethan dress. Now, you take somebody such as Lady Macbeth, then you can smell the sulphur as she comes on the stage. Then that is fun. And, of course, when I said earlier, in an offhand way, that Macbeth was not one of the great tragedies because of what happens to Macbeth at the end when he's really surrounded, I think the reason it doesn't sustain itself as a great tragedy is that Lady Macbeth dies. And when she dies, too early, Macbeth himself says she should have died hereafter. And for the good of the play, indeed she should, because she was the pillar of strength in villainy.
And in the household.
In the household, indeed.
Of course, in that case, there may have been too many murders, just as there are in too many detective stories. I think the detective story that has too many people knocked off weakens itself considerably.
And in Hamlet, it is really the skill of the production that keeps the audience from laughing, because there comes a moment when there is an excess of pain or an excess of grue or gore, when an audience begins to titter.
Well, to take the complete opposite of Gore, somebody else who has managed to create some enduring characters, somebody we would probably flinch at reading today, is Louisa M. Alcott. You know, Little Women, they're all riddled with virtue, and yet they're major living people.
I remember Little Women, I think largely because it has found its way onto the stage and the screen again and again, and I think I remember it largely because of Katharine Hepburn, if you want to know the honest truth. I would like to make a statement which is a strong conviction of mine, and this is when you come to the truth of character as realized in the theater. In the novel, the novelist is safe because he is describing his own character in his own terms, and we see him as so evoked. In the theater, every modern playwright is careful to describe, for the benefit of the reading public, not the play-going public, the characters and the stage directions. But it is my conviction that no character, or hardly any character, in a great play has ever reached the stage exactly looking like and acting like and being like the character that the dramatist had in mind. One of the reasons that I think Hamlet, for example, endures as an acting reality is that there is no final Hamlet. Hamlet comes to life according to the body of each single actor and the gifts and temperament and voice of each actor playing him. And Hamlet can be interpreted in 100 ways. There's no static Hamlet. When I was young, Hamlet was played first by Mr. E.H. Sothern, and Hamlet, as Mr. Sothern played him, and Sothern was an admirable Malvolio and Petruchio. Sothern's Hamlet was almost the last. It was as if Mr. Alf Landon had suddenly dropped the sunflower and decided to be the prince of businessmen, and there he was. Then came the period of Hamlets that were neurotic. They sat on those swayback chairs, Savonarola chairs, and always prayed for a green spotlight and looked as if they should be taken off to the nearest institution.
Or as I think you once wrote in a review or said in a lecture, that they all looked like interior decorators.
Well, like some interior decorators. You see, I'm growing mellower. And then, of course, suddenly there came, not the final Hamlet by any means, but then there came Mr. Maurice Evans' Hamlet, and he bounded into Elsinore with the vigor of a legionnaire.
He always reminded me of an all-American halfback.
Well, I'm glad you said halfback, because it seemed to me a beautifully spoken Hamlet and an entirely justified interpretation. Do you remember he based his Hamlet, he didn't take the weakling and the to be or not to be, and indecision. He took Hamlet as a politically minded prince who had a habit of procrastination rather than of total postponement. And you remember at the end, Hamlet says, I have the means, the will, the strength to do what is demanded of me. And he played it on the basis of will, means, and strength, troubled by this dilemma of indecision.
Gielgud, of course, played it entirely differently.
This is my whole point. Mr. Hamlet, I am convinced, can be played in any number of ways. I've tried to indicate that there is no final Hamlet, and that Hamlet takes on the body and mind and the dimensions of the actor who attempts the part.
It's even been played by women.
I'm always glad, I'm eternally grateful for many things in this world, and one is that I had never happened to see Charlotte Cushman or Eva Le Gallienne or any of the women who have attempted Hamlet. Marmism can be carried to an ultimate point in this country, but God defend Denmark. But I want to say that there are certain parts that certain actors could not ever be expected to play. I have mentioned Ophelia. I think no matter how hard she tried, and in spite of the amplitude of her talents, I do not think that Mae West would fit easily into the role of Ophelia.
Or even into the dress.
She should. Now take somebody such as Brigitte Bardot, that she is eye-filling, that she is a welcome part of the landscape. Indeed, if not a landscape in herself, I will not deny. I have my full sense of gratitude. But I do not believe that she would be a very impressive Medea. Not yet. She may. She may in time. What I'm trying to say is the point frequently overlooked, that the actor, and this is where he's different from the writer when it comes to the revelation of character, the actor is the only artist who, so to speak, has to be the grocery man and the spinach that he is selling to. It is his physical limitation that can determine whether he's going to be a straight actor or a character actor. There's another thing when we say play. I'm talking about the necessity to act a part, no matter whether it's written for you or what it is. One of the misconceptions of judgment when it comes to acting, it seems to me, and if I were an actor, I would resent it violently, is that people have a way of saying, and they think it's praise, the highest praise. They will say, as they did years ago, they'll say, oh, Helen Hayes, she doesn't act Queen Victoria, she is Queen Victoria. Well, that seems to me the most arrant nonsense and the greatest insult.
To both women.
Well, you wouldn't say to Heifetz, he doesn't play the violin, he is the fiddle. It would irritate him beyond belief to have no technical mastery of the medium that he is in command of. Now I come back to how the actor can change what is the characterization. If you look up any Shaw play, because Shaw, of course, was writing for readers as well as for audiences, you will find that the characters, such as the Reverend Morel in Candida, are carefully described. The cut of the chin, the color of the eyes, the twinkle, whether there's a slight furrow in the forehead or the left brow or the right brow. All that is good reading, but it has nothing to do with what happens in the theater. One of the most dangerous things that a playwright can do is to describe a character too gloriously before the character enters. May I give you the most deadly stage direction in the world, I believe. It's the hardest to live up to, and it's one of the most beautiful and best known lines in English dramatic literature. This is in Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, when the poor woman who's going to play Helen of Troy has to appear, and she walks across the stage and then begins, "Is this the face that launched 1,000 ships?" Well, that would sink an actress. I don't know about launching ships. I have never seen anyone who could live up to those lines. Take, for example, Congreve's introduction in The Way of the World of Millamant. I've seen actresses live up to this, but this too is difficult. Mirabell, the man, says, as the heroine enters about Millamant, he says, "Here she comes, i' faith, full sail, with her fans spread and streamers out, and a shoal of fools for tenders." Now, the wisdom of that line as an introduction, the superior wisdom as compared to the Marlowe line is that it doesn't actually describe her.
No, virtually anybody could.
Well, with her fans spread and streamers out.
Yes.
And carefully comes the qualifying line, "and a shoal of fools for tenders," so that you have already begun to characterize her, but you have the sense of a glorious woman making an entrance, and that is up to the actress who's playing the part.
Well, in O'Neill's Moon for the Misbegotten, he elaborately describes the character, who was played by Wendy Hiller, as a great, hulking, 250-pound farm girl.
Oh, I remember.
And Wendy Hiller, of course, looked totally unlike that. She probably weighs 105.
It was one of the most depressing descriptions of character. I've forgotten the woman's name, the character's name, but she was described as this giantess of a woman.
Yes.
With great sagging breasts, with great flat feet, as being a kind of earth mother. She always seemed to me like the last dinosaur. And she was just appallingly unattractive, may I say. I was so glad that Wendy Hiller looked the way she did, rather than the way O'Neill meant the character to play, and she was equally convincing, in fact, more so.
She was wonderful.
Wonderful. Now, can we go beyond the theater and the novel just for the moment? I would like, if it's possible, to touch upon a point made earlier, and this is where you were saying people can conceal themselves in dialogue.
Chiefly by saying no comment.
I disagree with you there. No comment, if repeated too frequently in a press conference, makes the comment all of its own, and it usually gives away what is meant to be hidden. But if you read a newspaper account, no matter how well done, you have to read column after column by the most skillful of reporters to have the visual sense of what has happened to the face while the man is talking, the running description.
Exactly. A transcript of the president's press conference, for example, totally fails, or in many cases fails.
Well, it's quite different from being in the room. I remember years ago waiting to go on some TV show myself when the Whittaker Chambers thing was all in the air, and I remember reading the transcript of that cross-examination the next day. But I happened to see it because our program was delayed until the hearing was over. I happened to watch it in the studio on the monitoring screen. And what happened to Chambers' face, the saliva that came to the corner of his mouth, or the gesture, the grasping of the face, all of these things made revelations which couldn't be reported. And I have seen interviews with Nehru and Dewey and Aldous Huxley were the three. And just before them, Krishna Menon on the air with the close-up. You didn't need a Mike Wallace in any of these cases because the camera is a Mike Wallace. People come through or they don't come through for what they are, and there's no hiding from that camera. It reveals everything.
Well, I'm not sure that's entirely right. Supposing somebody can unwittingly emerge unsatisfactorily on television simply because he is tongue-tied, he is shy, he is embarrassed, he may give a totally false impression of what he's really like.
I'm not talking about performance, nor am I talking about the faces put on by people in booths during the quiz programs. I'm talking about a straight interview when a person is relaxed, and it's a pro who happens to be on it. I'm talking about any man in public life, whether it's Dewey, Stevenson, Eisenhower, any person who is accustomed.
But he may be so accustomed to doing it that he may be able to be so smooth, so suave, as to conceal some of his characteristics.
Well, we now go back to a figure for whom I happen to have great admiration, and this is President Eisenhower. President Eisenhower, if you read, as you said, the transcript, can give the most controlled answer, and his spiritual discipline is extraordinary. But President Eisenhower, if you watch him carefully at a press conference, and certainly even in the televised versions of the press conferences, you can see temper when it is aroused and when the cord rises in the forehead. But the speech contradicts it because his self-discipline is so great that what he may feel, though it shows in his face, is controlled in his words. This is what I'm trying to say.
Yes, well, simply by going over the transcripts of press conferences of Roosevelt, Truman, and Eisenhower, you do learn something about the three men, even though the facial expressions and all the rest of it aren't there. You've got Roosevelt's badinage with the press, you've got Truman's occasional snappiness with the press, and Eisenhower's reluctance to engage in any kind of personality at all.
Well, his resolute refusal. He rises above that. I would agree. Now, when you come to, say, Franklin Roosevelt, and as you say, in the press conferences, you have the quickness of the mind, the agility of Mr. Roosevelt's mind, and his high enjoyment of crossing swords with the press, and the kind of easy, obvious laughter with which he had sometimes slapped them down. Mr. Truman's belligerency can come across superbly. I had a press conference in Detroit with Governor Williams present. Mr. Truman was asked by the reporters inevitably who should be the Democratic candidate next time. And to everybody's consternation, because Governor Williams was there, he said, well, there's one man I'm violently against, and he's in this room. And I guess I know who he is because I'm he. Which was a happy twist on the whole thing, and a revelation of Mr. Truman's.
Williams must have been ashen-faced when he started
Well,
out.
I would assume so.
Yes.
You can tell instantly whether a person, when he begins to talk, has any felicity with speech, whether he has any command of language, exactly as you can when you pick up a novel or a book. You can tell whether the person is a writer or someone just trying to write. And this varies where the writer reveals himself. His vocabulary and his negotiation of language is his self-revelation, as well as his attitude towards life.
Can you think of an example of a writer unconsciously revealing himself? I think I've seen it written that Arnold Bennett unconsciously revealed himself in his novels as a social climber, for example.
Well, I could give you on that basis two writers, it seems to me, who reveal themselves unconsciously. One is, of course, Arnold Bennett, who was always surprised by comfort and impressed by price tags. He was well aware of what it cost to run a yacht, because he finally got enough money from diligent hackdom as well as superb novel writing to buy one himself. I'll give you an American novelist who always seemed to me surprised by the thickness of a carpet. I'm speaking of Joseph Hergesheimer. He seems so startled, so amazed that a house should have, which you assume a house has, all the things, the amenities of life. And it was, in a way, his sense of wonder that added to what was graphic and sensual in his description.
I'm grateful for the fact that Hergesheimer was that sort of person, because I think that was what was really good about his writing.
It was that startled observation.
Yes, the wonder of it all.
Well, writing cannot come from assumption. It has to have discovery even in what is taken for granted. Mr. Marquand is someone who takes these things for granted yet observes them shrewdly. Well, he always puts in the inventory, but he doesn't do it with that sense of surprise. And there is the difference there. Speaking of giveaway phrases and the revelation of character, there's one that has always driven me crazy about both novels and plays and motion pictures and TV programs too, and that is the person who cheerfully bobs up, the person who has ivory soap in his heart and is always on the top of the tub and says, the world is so sad, why do we have to see anything that's sad? I've heard many intelligent people surrender to what is that absolute blockheadism.
Goodness knows my daily life is difficult enough and so on.
Yes, yes.
I don't want to see that when I go to the theater.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, Mr. Hillman. That is a final surrender to the misjudgment and total failure to appreciate what is the difference between life and art and the function of the artist and what happens to be the mere necessity for living. Art has to achieve its truth in terms of deliberate falsehoods, and the deliberate falsehoods happen to end up in glorious revelations and glorious truths. The falsehoods, so carefully devised, can be truer than the greatest truths that we know in life. I always remember a line of André Maurois, People, you know, have often complained that mere contrivance in art is nothing but artifice. And because it is artifice, certain people have rejected it, saying it isn't real. But Maurois pointed out that the word artifice, he said, happens to contain the word art. And that, I believe, is the core of the whole distinction between the realm of make-believe, or the revealed truth of character, and character as it happens to exist unedited in the world around us.
Well, of course, that's all well and good for fiction or make-believe literature and drama. But what does the artist do about his deliberate falsehoods when he wishes to achieve the glorious truths in biography or autobiography? Which leads me to the point that people seem more and more eager these days to read the real thing, not dressed-up fiction, but biography and autobiography, dressed up, if you will, as in the case of the somewhat lurid accounts by Diana Barrymore, Lillian Roth, and others, but also the tremendously serious and scholarly biographies of people like Queen Elizabeth I, which has been such a bestseller. And so during our next discussion, Mr. Brown, I should like you to turn to this whole question of biography and autobiography, this searching examination of other people's lives, and see if we can't determine why it has become such a popular form of literature and also so enormously popular on the movie and television screens.